Welcome to our next session, Payer Coverage Strategy, Evidence Data, and Guidelines Required. My name is Maureen Leonard. I'm the Director of the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment at Mass General Brigham for Children and an Associate Professor at Harvard Medical School, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to thank the SSCD and the Celiac Disease Foundation, as well as sponsors, for organizing such an important and educational symposium. In this session, we have absolutely amazing speakers, as we have all day, who will help us examine, in this case, the evidence standards, pricing considerations, health economic analysis, and policy frameworks necessary to achieve sustainable payer coverage for future celiac disease therapies. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Bloom. Jonathan Bloom is a nationally recognized expert in federal health insurance policy and healthcare financing. He is co-founder and co-managing partner of Health Transformation Strategies and a non-resident scholar at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Most recently, John served as Principal Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where he led agency operations and policy implementation. During the Obama administration, he also served as CMS Deputy Administrator and Director for the Center for Medicare. John has held leadership roles across healthcare and consulting policy, payer organizations, and serves on multiple healthcare boards and advisory committees. His talk is titled Payer Coverage Strategy, Navigating Complexity and Preparing for Early Engagement. So Jonathan, thank you so much.
Great. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll try and share my slides. I'm never quite good at this, but just give me 1 second.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really nice to be here. And part of my goal here is just to kind of set some grounding for us for how we think about coverage policies throughout the U.S., but more important for how we think about best strategies to help educate payers to ensure coverage, to ensure access once new drugs come to market. I want to just start with some kind of grounding points that I think most people here know, but just to kind of help us frame the conversation. It is not required in our country to have health insurance in order to get access to drugs. Any patient can go to the pharmacy with a script and pay out of pocket. But we know that for most patients, they don't have the means, they don't have the resources in order to pay out of pocket. Therefore, having insurance coverage really is critical to ensuring access. The other sort of fact for us just to set the table of is we have no single insurance system here in our country. Most people have coverage through their employer, through the government, through their own means, and each of those plan options have their own rules for coverage, their own rules for reimbursement, and their own rules for which drugs they should cover. For those covered by government programs, there are constraints, there are protections, but I think a current fact to our matter is that there's no single policy, no single rule for how health insurance plans cover drugs. The third thing to know is that even those drugs that are that pass the FDA clearance, they're on the market to patients. There is no requirement that insurance plans have to cover every drug that gets approved by the FDA. And insurance plans, generally follow different standards of determining what's reasonable, necessary, compared to the FDA, whose mandate is to determine what is safe and effective. And generally, most health insurance plans do cover drugs that are approved, but particularly for new drugs, there is no guarantee. For those covered by the Medicare program, they receive drug coverage through competing private drug plans. Those private plans have the right to set formularies, cost-sharing policies. Second, those who are covered by the Medicaid program that is now covering the most people in our country for any single system. Medicaid plans must cover every drug that signs an agreement with the state Medicaid organizations. But again, some manufacturers don't sign that agreement, and states are still permitted to apply cost control tools to ensure they don't pay too much. And those who are covered by private insurance, they have different state mandates, different federal mandates. There's no single system here in our country. I think another important factor for us to consider is, particularly for the Medicare program, in general, the Medicare program doesn't reimburse pharmaceutical companies directly. Um, they, the program reimburses hospitals, pharmacists, pharmacies, etc. So there is no direct relationship from insurance plans to drug manufacturers that, that even further complicates the story. All insurance plans, whether they're Medicare, whether they're Medicaid, whether they're private insurance, again, they have the freedom to decide which drugs to cover, how to impose cost sharing limits, how to think about prior authorization policies. And this story really is complex. And I think just to set the grounding, I wanted to just kind of state the facts for the context that we operate in. And so thinking about the context, thinking about how drug coverage works here in our country, um, there's certain strategies that we have to think about to ensure that patients get access to drugs that come to market, drugs that are game changing. The first is just to recognize what I said during the first part of the conversation is that payers and the FDA have different mandates for how they think about coverage, access, et cetera. And so payers generally operate from the standard of they have to determine what is reasonable and necessary, which means in practice they have to consider those drugs, those medical devices, surgical procedures as things they cover that are better than what's currently in place. And so that really is the key to any argument to encourage payers to cover drugs is that a particular drug, a device, procedure, et cetera, is better than what's currently available. There's some sort of argument that it's that has a greater impact, that it's more cost effective, but that really is the standard for a payer. Insurance companies, they have very strong financial incentives to ensure beneficiaries get steered towards those drugs, devices, procedures that are more cost effective. It means that any argument to cover something new and has to be deemed to be as cost effective, hopefully more cost effective than current practices of care. I think the third point too for us to remember is the insurance company is not the ultimate decider. The ultimate decider is physicians that prescribe, hospitals that deliver procedures, in addition to the education part for payers. Any good strategy will also consider how we convince physicians, how we convince healthcare practitioners that some new drug, some new device, some new procedure really is key for good patient care. So any strategy to ensure coverage and access has to involve the physician, has to involve the healthcare system to ensure that that coverage access works. Fourth point for any good strategy is to assume that insurance plans have the best intentions to provide drug coverage, other coverage that best serves their members. But they have limited resources, and chances are that an insurance company, when making a decision, doesn't have the expertise, doesn't have the staff to ensure they're making good decisions. So any strategy has to consider the health plans current resources, the expertise they have, and also to assume that, their decisions get made, just based upon lack of good information. So it's really key going forward to ensure that you're helping the plan know what's available, helping the plan understand what's the best possible treatment for their members, and it really helping connect the dots. And the last thing I will say, just before turning over to the other speakers, is that we often assume that insurance companies they make decisions because they have some kind of financial incentive, which they often do. But insurance company really is a fiduciary to those paying the bills, taxpayers, employers. And those insurance companies write contracts that are based upon the direction, the values for those paying the bills, taxpayers, beneficiaries, enrollees, uh, 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 large employers. And so any strategy needs to ensure that those that are giving direction to insurance plans, paying for the resources, they also demand that patients get access to the best technologies, the most cost-effective technologies. But our patchwork system, which has no single rule, which has no single standard for coverage for access, um, that's our current environment. We can't necessarily change that. However, we can think about very strong strategies that take into account the system, that takes into account the actors uh, that drive the system. And most important, we need to make sure that those who are giving direction to insurance companies, taxpayers, Congress, the White House, uh, 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 large employers, they're also demanding that those that they care for have access to the best possible care, treatment, drugs, devices, etc. So with that, we'll stop. I wanted to one kind of set the context for the conversation, but then second to really articulate what are the best possible strategies for advocates, for patients, and those that care for them.
Thank you so much for that great talk. A lot to unpack there. But we'll head on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Alexander Ashmiansky. He's the founder and CEO of the Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug Company, created to address the high cost of generic medications for patients. The physician, mathematician, and entrepreneur, Alex earned a BA in biochemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder at age 18, an MD from Duke University School of Medicine, and a PhD in mathematics from Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. He completed medical training at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and previously served on the faculty at Stanford University School of Medicine. Alex continues to practice as an emergency radiologist and previously founded the healthcare startup Altitude Medical. Alex, thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Let's see, maybe I can share some slides as well if I am savvy enough to figure out how to do that. There we go. It worked. Yay. So yeah, my name is Alex Oshmiansky. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug Company. Our goal is to make pharmaceuticals more affordable for the patients that need them. I think a good case example that might affect a lot of members of sort of the community here is we have a product called mesalamine, which is used by a lot of patients in the GI community broadly. And before we started working on this project of reducing generic drug costs, it was counted as one of these so-called specialty generic medications. So although it's generic, it's long off patent, it had an extremely high list cost. So it would cost, anywhere from, $1,000 plus for a month's supply of the generic medication, be that the suppository formulation or be that the oral dose formulation. And what we would regularly see is patients being asked to pay, a $300 or $1,000 copayment for that product. Meanwhile, if you went directly to the manufacturers, the true cost of the drug was about $30 to $60 for a month's supply. So what we did at Cost Plus Drugs is, we did that. We acquired it at its true cost, added a flat 15% markup, $5 fee to pay the pharmacist, $5 shipping and handling, and brought the out-of-pocket cost of that drug down somewhere along the lines of 90% overnight. So how did that come to be? How did it come to be that this drug that is generally pretty inexpensive across the rest of the world, and even inexpensive to those who buy it in the United States, to the wholesalers and pharmacies that buy it, that the patients wound up getting an enormously inflated cost for it by a 1,000-fold at times.
Alex, sorry to interrupt. Can you go into the main presentation mode? You're in presenter mode right now.
Oh yeah, let's see if I can. Let's see, did that work?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I know this is an audience with a lot of health policy experts in it, so forgive me if some of this stuff is repetitive, but yeah, I wanted to just sort of get everyone on the same page. So a lot of what we work on is getting past these organizations called pharmacy benefit managers. So what is a pharmacy benefit manager? Well, if we go back to the 1980s, let's say, we had drugs were getting expensive enough for the first time to really be covered by your health insurance plan. And this is an era before before computers were widespread throughout industry. And in order to actually do the administrative work of paying for pharmaceuticals, you'd have to do a ton of paperwork. You'd have to contract with 60,000 pharmacies nationwide and send back and forth forms. So an industry got set up to do this paperwork on behalf of insurance companies. And initially they, decided, hey, we'll charge you 10 cents a claim to do the work of, passing paperwork back and forth between a pharmacy and an insurance company to actually get paid. But what eventually the pharmacy benefit managers were, doing the payment processing realized is, hey, we are paying for all the drugs anyway. What if we offer an additional service? We will actually negotiate the price of the drugs on behalf of the plan sponsor. And you know what? To align us with the interests of the plan sponsor, we won't even ask for any money for doing this service. We will just take a percentage of the savings. We will get rebates off the cost of the drugs, and we will just ask for, say, 10% of the amount of savings that we provide. So, I think it became apparent to the industry very quickly, how do you maximize your absolute value of your percentage cut of a rebate? Well, what if you start off with an absurdly high sticker price and get a very large percentage rebate off of that? So there's a lot of different prices in pharmaceutical pricing, WAC, wholesale acquisition cost, but the one we work off most commonly in the generic drug industry is so-called AWP, average wholesale price. And, our position is that all of these sort of fake list prices are, the worst thing in pharma pricing. So how does it work? To use an analogy, let's say you wanted to buy a Toyota Prius or Toyota Corolla. And you know what? You hate negotiating. It sucks. It's a miserable process. The dealer is sleazy. And somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I am a professional car negotiator. I do this all day, every day. I'm probably going to do it better than you. I do it in bulk, so I get better prices. All I ask is, in exchange for doing this, I'd like a commission of the savings. And you go, you know what? Why not? Let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. This will be much more pleasant than me doing it myself. And the negotiator goes off and does his or her thing and comes back like a week later and says, you know what, I have amazing news for you. Amazing news. I got you 90% off the price of your Toyota Camry. And you're like, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? That's insane. And, the negotiator goes, think nothing of it. And it turns out sticker price was $1 million. And now you're stuck paying $100,000 for the Toyota Camry. And not only that, but you owe 10% of the savings to the negotiator. So you're actually out another $90,000. And to add insult to injury, the negotiator also gets to keep the difference between the real cost of the Toyota Camry, $25,000, and the sticker cost of $100,000. So that is the so-called spread pricing there. So, the U.S., this is a famous statistic, pays from the Rand Institute, pays 2.56 times more for pharmaceuticals per capita than any other comparable nation. And that seems a little crazy because we have enormous paid negotiators on behalf of the American population. So, kind of one of two things is happening from our perspective. Either one, the negotiators are just really bad at their job. The pharmacy benefit managers are just really bad at negotiating drug costs. Or two, they have misaligned incentives. And, sort of obviously from my tone, I kind of go towards the sort of second part of that. And what we find is PBMs, this is from Ohio Medicare Medicaid statistics. They found that after an attorney general investigation, almost 30% of gross generic spending went to PBM, just PBM margin. So yeah, policymakers increasingly became aware of this. This became a very hot button topic on Capitol Hill for the past 5-10 years or so. And obviously this is sort of an absurd situation. People aren't going to let it stand. So the PBMs actually said, we're going to get out ahead of this proactively. We're going to pass through 100% of the rebate dollars that we see, and we're going to get rid of spread pricing. But if there happens to be a subsidiary entity of the PBMs, so-called rebate aggregators that's totally legally distinct, that sees the rebate dollars first and provides the service of aggregating them together, well, they are allowed to charge fees before passing them along to the parent PBMs. And these are the big three PBMs and the big three rebate aggregators that they are associated with. And this is where I get a little tinfoil hatty because of these three, none of them has a web page. And I could only find a logo for one, which is Ascent Health Services. I could actually find that logo. I got very excited about that. But by revenue, these are three of the largest companies on earth. They'd all be at least Fortune 20 because all of the rebate dollars and all of the pharmaceutical payments eventually go through these largely foreign domiciled entities. So yeah, increasingly you see pharmacy benefit managers essentially moving their centers of profitability from one area to another. And in particular, I want to bring attention to this area of specialty pricing, which is where you get these enormously overinflated generic drug costs. Because what the PBM can say is we also own a pharmacy. And because products like mesalamine are specialty products, you have to buy them from us because we are the only ones able to provide the special service of handling them. And then they can basically charge an arbitrary amount because they have basically a captive customer. Basically, they can refer clients to themselves and charge as they will. So you can see over this 6-year time period, the percentage profitability from captive pharmacies that the PBMs own goes from 17% here all the way up to 36%. And similarly, you see the amount of profitability they get from 15% to 30%, while the amount attributable to rebate dollars and spread goes consistently down over time. Now, what does this mean for, sorry, I want to be cognizant of time before I get too far into PBM specific statistics. What does this all mean for coverage of pharmaceuticals? Particularly brand and true specialty medications that a lot of patients in this disease community need. Essentially you have misaligned incentives from the pharmacy benefit managers that pick the formularies, which is they are optimizing, they do have PNT committees, therapeutic committees that do a therapeutic evaluation to see if the product meets a clinical need and is efficacious. But they also have another incentive, which is to optimize the amount of money they're getting paid by the pharmaceutical companies to put the product on the formulary. So which pharmaceutical company is paying them the most in fees, the most in rebate dollars, the most in spread pricing, whatever the case may be, which one is allowing a private label program through their in-house private label pharmaceutical company, which one's willing to do an exclusive deal with their specialty pharmacy. So you have this whole host of misaligned incentives within the pharmacy benefit manager industry to not necessarily allow access to the most efficacious product, but allow access to the product that provides the most in revenue for the pharmacy benefit manager. In terms of how to fight against that, at Cost Plus, we ourselves are not a policy shop. That's not our thing. There's very good people, some of which are my co-presenters here, that do focus on policy and are very, very good at it. But what we encourage is to try to convince your employer, if you're at a self-insured employer, or your insurance company, to switch from a large pharmacy benefit manager, one of the big national chains, to a smaller, transparent PBM. And there's over 50 small to mid-cap PBMs, which don't charge any of these fees or any nonsense, that aren't transparent to the members. So what we encourage is sort of market-centric reform, and encouraging people to move from bad actors in the industry to good actors who at least do not have these same economically misaligned incentives. And with that, I think I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm going to cut myself off there.
Thank you so much. Such an interesting story, and I know we'll have a lot of questions for you. So thanks again for being here and for that talk. Thanks.
Of course.
Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Garabedian. Laura is a health services researcher and assistant professor in the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. The overarching goal of her research is to inform evidence-based health insurance policy to improve population health. Her research focuses on the evaluation of state and national health insurance policies and insurer strategies to improve value of care delivery in the areas of chronic disease, maternal and child health, and pharmaceuticals. In addition to her research portfolio, Dr. Garabedian leads educational and training programs for medical students, PhD students, and clinical fellows. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Maureen. Can you see my slides?
I can. They look great.
Excellent. So thanks for that introduction. Just a little bit about my background and how I ended up in this session. I'm a health policy and insurance researcher who focuses largely on chronic conditions, maternal child health, and pharmaceuticals. I have a somewhat unique vantage point because I'm at a medical school department that's actually affiliated with a payer. So I use a lot of that payer perspective to both inform my research questions, but also to inform how I interpret the results of my studies. And then finally, where sort of work and life have collided, I am actually the caregiver of a child with celiac disease. And here's a picture from a couple of weeks ago at the Red Sox Celiac Awareness Night. And this is my 6-year-old with celiac disease enjoying his first Fenway Frank. And my disclosures, I have research funding from the NIH and foundations, and these views are my own. So I'm going to talk about the key stakeholders in payer coverage, and actually it'll kind of bring together Jonathan and Alexander's talks, the cover environment for payers, and then factors that influence payers' decision to cover therapeutics, and then manage utilization and costs, and then really bring it home to talk about some key evidence for the coverage of celiac therapeutics. So what we heard in Jonathan's talk, payers, which we also call health insurers, and health plans are largely grouped into two buckets of public and private. However, there really this is sort of a false dichotomy, since a lot of commercial payers actually manage all of Medicare Part D outpatient costs. Over half of Medicare beneficiaries are on Medicare Advantage plans, which are commercial, and then a large proportion of Medicaid beneficiaries are managed by Medicaid managed care organizations. So in addition to payers, when we think about coverage, we have to consider pharma companies who are developing the drugs, pharmacy benefit managers, which we just heard a whole bunch about, providers and health systems, patients, consumers, employers, who I think are really important here, and I'll talk a little more about, the FDA, and then advocacy groups like the Celiac Foundation. And so we just heard a lot about pharmacy benefit managers, so I'll be really brief here. This is not the focus of my talk, but one, many are vertically integrated with national payers, which I think is important to understand. The other thing about PBMs is they manage the formulary management and benefit design for about 2/3 of commercial payers. And a lot of formulary placement is largely driven by these rebates that we heard of. And so there's really this incentive to procure higher cost drugs and not higher value and cost effective drugs. But in the next couple of years, I think we're going to see a lot of changes in this space. So what is the current environment for payers? And it's a challenging one right now. So commercial payers have experienced record losses in the last few years. State Medicaid budgets are increasingly constrained by high costs and also federal policy pressures. And there's been this really heightened focus on what the industry calls total cost of care and how do we reduce that. And so high cost pharmaceuticals are a key driver of these rising costs. And when you look at the top therapeutic areas of pharmaceutical spending in the US, GLP-1s, oncology, and then autoimmune diseases and immunology are in the top three. And something to be aware of, too, as we talk about payer coverage, with recent federal policies, we're actually going to see an increase in uninsurance among both the commercial and public sectors. And so we have to think about how we ensure access to these uninsured populations as well. So what are factors that influence a payer's decision to cover therapeutics? One, as we heard, is FDA approval, and FDA determines if the drug is safe and effective. And then payers are also considering cost and cost effectiveness and really getting at what is the value of the drug. And so when they're looking at this, they're looking at whether the drug offsets other healthcare costs like specialist visits or hospitalizations. A key problem with this calculation is that for many chronic conditions, the cost of the drug is often incurred now, but the benefits often not recouped for a longer time horizon. So with people who churn health insurance, which is pretty common, and they switch to different health insurers every year, every couple of years, the cost that they incur now may not be recouped by the current insurer. It removes the incentive to be paying for certain drugs. And the focus of a lot of these calculations is only on healthcare costs and not the other costs of celiac disease, like food or other societal barriers. In addition to cost, payers also consider what's called budget impact. So this is driven by the cost of a drug, but also the number of members that use a therapeutic. So an example of this is GLP-1s, which are expensive, although they're now largely considered to be cost effective. But because so many people used them, there's a huge budget impact, and it led to most private and public insurers dropping coverage, particularly for obesity. Kind of mixed up into this cost effectiveness calculation is comparative effectiveness. And so when you're determining whether to cover a drug, you want to know, is it more effective and also more cost effective than other therapeutics available on the market? And then, as was mentioned, there's federal and state regulations that require coverage of certain drug classes. So payers have many strategies to manage pharmaceutical utilization and costs, and we've heard about some of these. So one, they determine if a drug is on or off formulary. And this, again, is largely a PBM decision, but about 1/3 of commercial payers actually do manage their own formularies. It's also important to note that state Medicaid agencies and Medicaid MCOs often also use PBMs, so they really are affecting the broad majority of patients. Formulary placement is also really important, and this has to do with cost sharing and co-payment tiers. And so, so when you're a new drug on the market, are you going to be preferred brand or non-preferred brand or a specialty tier? Benefit designs are a way that insurers try to manage pharmaceutical use, and a blunt instrument is high deductible health plans. There's now some insurers are playing around with other value-based benefit designs, like $0 copays for prescription drugs that they know are high value, or excluding certain drugs from the deductible. They also use utilization management strategies like prior authorization and step therapy. And this is, I think, where what's on the label and what we require before treatment is really important. And then there's care management programs where they try to improve adherence to high-value pharmaceuticals. And so formulary placement and benefit design influence patient out-of-pocket costs, and this impacts utilization. So here are some other payer considerations that influence coverage that I've seen along with my research and other experiences. So as I mentioned, and I think employers are a big part of this puzzle that are potentially less focused on because they're sort of distributed across different companies. But most of people are commercially insured in the U.S., and about over 60 to 2/3 of them are insured by self-insured employers, meaning that the employer is taking on the financial risk, and the insurer is like a third-party administrator doing the administration of the benefit. But the employers actually have a lot of say in what the benefit design looks like and what's covered. Insurance companies tend to be really concerned with what their competitors are covering and how. And so usually you'll see a lot of movement if they all move together. So if one company in a region covers a drug, the others usually follow suit, and vice versa. If one stops covering something, they often follow suit. And a big part of this has to do with what is called in the industry adverse selection, right? So they don't want to be the only insurer covering a high-cost drug, or else all of the patients with those healthcare needs are going to come to that insurer, and that starts sort of it's a really adverse selection kind of death spiral is what we call it, in that they attract more high-cost members. So that's just something to consider. And this is why we saw once one insurer stopped covering GLP-1s in a region, most of the ones in the region also stopped covering them. Another thing that they really focus on, I think, is advocacy and media attention. And they really care about their public image. And this largely influences, I think, the market share of members, right? So people are choosing with their feet, and marketing really matters. Payers also care a lot about quality measurement, and there's no celiac specific HEDIS quality measures, but there are quality measures for overlapping conditions such as type 1 diabetes and osteoporosis. And there's been a lot of development in the last couple of years on value-based purchasing arrangements with drug manufacturers, where there's sort of outcome-based arrangements. So you're making sure what you're paying, actually, you get high value for. And so let's bring it home to celiac disease specifically. So in terms of the direct healthcare costs of celiac disease, we see pre-diagnosis spikes in healthcare spending, pretty large diagnosis year costs. And I think there's a whole other talk that could be done about opportunities for more efficient and timely and cost-effective diagnostic testing. But I think where the therapeutics really come in is how do we sort of try to curb these ongoing costs? And so we know people with celiac disease have higher frequency of outpatient visits, hospitalizations, and prescriptions. They have higher risk for comorbid conditions, which are more expensive. And even 2 years after a diagnosis, people with celiac disease continue to have significantly higher healthcare costs per year than other people. In addition to direct healthcare costs, there's the patient cost of a gluten-free diet for life. And this is about 200% more expensive than traditional gluten-containing equivalents. And then there's the societal cost. So there's lost education and work opportunities, but there's also loss of productivity among workers. And I think employers care a lot about this. So in terms of key evidence for coverage of therapeutics, I think payers are going to be thinking about the value. So are these drugs clinically effective? Do they reduce direct healthcare costs and also the societal costs associated with celiac disease in both the short and longer term? And are they more effective than other options? And then thinking about the budget impact. So celiac disease is a relatively rare disease compared to other chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes or obesity. But what's interesting is we think it's underdiagnosed and prevalence will increase more with widespread diagnostic testing. And this will actually increase the market demand, which actually may spur R&D, but it also isn't going to increase the budget impact of whatever drugs come to the market. And so how will payers likely examine the clinical value of celiac therapeutics? So they're going to think, clinically, does it improve symptoms? And what they are thinking of, does this reduce utilization and costs? Does it heal mucosa? Does that prevent future complications? Is quality of life improved? And is this improvement large enough to justify the price? And then thinking about if adherence is realistic and will the real world outcomes actually match what we see in the clinical trials? And I just want to close with a discussion about payer coverage of the only therapeutic we have on the market, which is gluten-free food. And other countries have stipends or prescriptions for gluten-free food, which are listed in this table. But some US states have Medicaid waivers to cover medically tailored meals or food as medicine programs for eligible members with chronic conditions, including celiac disease. And in Massachusetts, they have a medically tailored meal program that's part of a health-related social needs services program funded by Medicaid. And an article that came out a week or two ago found that the reductions in healthcare costs of this medically tailored meal program, which were driven by reduced ED visits and hospitalizations, almost completely offset the costs of the program. And this was in 7 months. So you can imagine, longer term, and people are on this diet, they could potentially even prevent further healthcare costs. So with that, I will close and look forward to your questions at the end of this panel.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I know we have some questions about that we'll get to for the panel, but I would love to move forward and introduce our last speaker, which is Dr. Ryan Holmeschild. He is a PharmD and currently Vice President of Pharmacy for Emory University and the Emory Health Plan, where he leads pharmacy strategy, benefit design, clinical services, formulary management, and medication use across one of the nation's largest academic health systems in Georgia's only NCI-designated comprehensive cancer center. Working closely with Emory Healthcare and Winship Cancer Institute leadership, he helps drive oncology and specialty pharmacy innovation through evidence-based care, value-driven programs. Ryan holds a certified pharmacy executive leader designation and serves on multiple national editorial and advisory boards. So thank you so much for being here. And he is going to talk to us about understanding health plan pharmacy decision-making.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard, and you're totally right. It's been so great to see all these topics come. So thanks for including me as part of this discussion. And hopefully everyone watching really is going to connect the dots between really what we're trying to go through as a whole and how the story builds upon each other. Let me move my presentation to presentation mode to make sure that that is done so everyone can see my screen okay. And I think we are in that direction. So I think understanding a health plan is really important, right? Because as a health plan, it's your job to steward the benefits, to get the most value for the therapies, to really create a great member experience, but to drive it with clinical innovation. And if we think about it largely, there's a large of self-funded employers out there where every dollar they spend on healthcare is coming out of their pocket. And that PBM or that TPA is really the intermediary switch to process the claim, but the decisions driving the formulary adoption are happening from the health plan perspective. And why is that important? Well, if employers are seeing right now about a 14% year-over-year rise in medical pharmacy spend trend, that's an issue because if you're $1 billion health plan spend, you're getting close to, over $100 million in growth year over year. Well, the question is, how do you maintain that? And the problem is, do you just absorb that on your company's P&L and the company just has to absorb that additional expense? Do you pass it on to your employees? That's not great, right? Because how do you recruit the best and the brightest? And so at the same regard, instead of just allowing the cost trend to rise and letting some vendor management, we're seeing health plans get involved. And we're going to bend that cost curve by clinical innovation, thinking it's outside of the box in the development, and really prioritizing value-based therapies, not just high rebate, not just clinical innovation, but a mix of the two. And I think that's really where we come, how formulary decisions are so vital to the work that we're doing. So my goals are to review a pharmacy and therapeutics review, how clinical management, governance, and evaluating the clinical data can drive your formulary selection, how the evidence to formulary adoption is so important. If there's proven lower cost therapies, don't just skip those. You need to have evidence. Is there head-to-head data? Is there not? Why not? And how do you utilize matching, adjust, and direct comparisons? What is that prior authorization everyone hears about? How does that help steward appropriate access without creating burden? And how do you balance that triple aim, right, of clinical benefit, that member in the middle and patient access, but also cost stewardship that's so important in creating a sustainable benefit for the members? So as we jump into it, one of the first things I'd like to review is the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. Many people hear about P&T. Hospitals, P&T committees. Hospitals utilize a P&T committee to determine if they're going to give something or a drug inpatient. Very similar. It's cost management with efficacy. And that's really what you see pulled through on the health plan perspective as well. So here you want your disease work specialist. If we're dealing something with gastroenterology, we want our GI specialists, we want our primary care, we want our community and academics to give feedback to the health plan. Is this a high prioritized therapy? There's 4 therapies that are branded within the same indication. Is there truly differences between the two? Is there not head-to-head data? And how do we want to prioritize that? Again, to steward cost and not have that Cheesecake Factory menu of options, but drill it down to a more prefix menu driven by clinical innovation. We want to get clinical pharmacists involved, directors and vice presidents of pharmacy, medical directors, but then the patient voice, right? How are you getting the member and the patient as part of that P&T committee? And then lastly, someone has to evaluate that pharmacoeconomic impact. There's always a cost per responder or a cost for therapeutic improvement, and that has to be part of the equation to create the member-centric sustainable benefit. So what do we involve? Well, there's the FDA approval, but usually FDA approvals are very broad. And so that's one thing to look at, but then you want to drill down to the specific inclusion and exclusion criteria of the trial. You want to make sure that medication's being used as it was studied. And that's the important piece. And so we get involved in what is the phase 3 clinical trial data, what were, responding criteria, what did the manufacturer leverage, and then what is the comparative effectiveness? Was it studied against a true head-to-head competitor? Or was it just placebo and that's not the relevant standard of care? And now we have to do a match and adjust and direct comparison to get more of that detail. How does the safety pertain? It might be similar efficacy, but if there's better safety, that's important to the members and we want to prioritize that. And then at the end of the day, therapies have been on the market, there's not head-to-head. How do we start to leverage real-world evidence to pull through some of the data we're looking at to make very informed decisions? So how often does the P&T committee meet? We meet quarterly. We have expedited review for breakthrough therapies, making sure that quarterly cadence is not, I would say, displacing innovation to our members and our patients. We want to have an annual re-review. How have prices changed? Are we taking that in consideration? Are there any safety signals we need to know about? And what formulary updates do we want to publish to our members? So I talked a little bit about clinical innovation, and I think that evidence is important, right? So we want to look at phase 3 randomized clinical controlled trials. What's the primary endpoints and safety endpoints? We want to make sure the trial was powered for the result, and someone is not just kind of getting a primary endpoint, trying to put all their weight on a secondary, and they didn't even power the trial for that reason. We want to make sure we're leading with evidence, and that's so important because we want to make sure the outcomes we're paying for are valuable as we steward those funds. We want to look at systematic reviews and meta-analysis. How does comparative effectiveness look like? What are some key differentials that we're seeing in the market? We're seeing that with the BTKI inhibitors when we look at cardiac outcomes since there wasn't head-to-head data. And then how do we evaluate the label, the REMS criteria? Is there safety considerations we need to think about? And then lastly, we do our own cost effectiveness analysis, but we can also leverage external reviews like ICER to say how is that cost per responder and quality playing into the formulary decisions we're utilizing. So at the end of the day, all that data gets packaged and you start to prioritize therapies based on their value and effectiveness. And you can create prioritized tiers, a non-prioritized tier if maybe there's similar efficacy but higher price. You might have a prior authorization required if there's concern that there could be inappropriate use or there's specific criteria that's needed to make sure this is an appropriate use of the medication. And then lastly, based on benefit design, some medications may be excluded. Maybe there's not clinical evidence. Maybe that evidence isn't comparative. There's a number of therapeutic equivalent options and the price just is not competitive. And so those are decisions that formulary management's making on an ongoing basis. So now that brings me to prior authorization. Prior authorizations, again, are a tool to steward appropriate use. The goal, though, is not to let them get to abrasion, where they're creating unnecessary abrasion and to balance that. So you want to look for, is there a diagnosis? Is there serology required? Is there a biopsy? Is that something you can attest to? Or is it so high cost you really want to make sure that's documented? Is there step therapy that could play? Is there a more cost-effective solution that would be used in frontline guidelines or has great standard of care documentation. And you want to make sure members are trying that therapy before going to high cost or potentially worse safety therapeutics. And then making sure that the right prescribers are using the right therapies. Is this within that expertise? Should it be a gastroenterologist or hepatologist? Should it be a qualified specialist? And then is there additional clinical justification that's needed? Is there a medical exemption? And then how do we get that plan review in a timely manner so patients can get access to the decision, the providers can get access to that decision in a timely manner? And as we can see below, there's key criteria: GI, confirmed diagnosis, specialist involvement, dietary compliance, or whether someone needs to show that they've been refractory to other standard of care therapies, therefore getting them access to these more advanced therapies or higher cost therapies earlier. So the key here, and hopefully you're hearing this throughout the presentation, is we got to balance clinical benefit, access, and cost. And as you can see, the members in the middle, right? So we want to make sure their formulary tier and cost share impact is affordable. We don't want to put unnecessary PA burden, but we want to do something that's standard of care. If someone's a gastroenterologist and they're going to run these tests to make a proper diagnosis, they're just pulling that data through on the prior authorization. We want to make sure we've got good network availability, provides member access, there's patient assistance programs, and if appeal or exception is needed, we need to create a pathway for that. And then we talked about the clinical benefit, magnitude of difference, durability of response, making sure the best therapies are the ones we're making available to our members, safety, what's the unmet need, and how do we start to consider quality of life impact? Because at the end of the day, those two are considered, and then we look at what's the net cost, how do we steward that net cost appropriately, and therefore create therapeutic cost benchmarks to say, hey, what is that cost effectiveness analysis and how are we driving value from a clinical efficacy standpoint, but also net cost perspective. And that tension between these pillars is always going to exist. And that's why we need sound judgment that puts the member in the middle as we prioritize treatments. So when I think about celiac disease, right, there's health plans that will assess disease complexity. What's the unmet need? Is there any biomarker or diagnostic standards that we need to make sure are there or that were done in the clinical trial? And what is that eligible patient profile? Because I think what strengthens access, right, is a randomized clinical controlled trial with an innovative endpoint, mucosal healing, not just clinical improvement. So we want to see these things continue to evolve. If there's a REMS program, how do we make sure our members aren't going to be held up in that program, but they can go through the program appropriately and get access? If we're seeing real-world evidence continue to develop, we need to look at that as a health plan to make sure we're incorporating that in the latest criteria. And then lastly, paying attention to advocacy. Advocacy is a huge part of what we do. We need to make sure we're listening, thinking of the patient's perspective as decisions are being made. And I think as I talk about advocacy, I wanted to have a slide on that because to me, it's so important to think about the member as what we do first. So is there evidence dossiers that we need to consider? Are there patient voices and stories? Are we linking prior authorizations between medical and pharmacy benefit to not create silos in the approval process? How are we engaging our medical directors to make sure they're staying up to date on the latest evidence and disease? And also reducing challenging prior authorizations. If we can make a pharmacy benefit PA look back to a J code on the medical benefit and not require a provider to submit documentation, how do we do that in real time and create less abrasion and faster time to approval or to a therapeutic decision? So in totality, I'll finish out that Celiac Disease Foundation is so important to this, and so are you all, because we need to make sure P&T committees are creating good evidence-based decisions, efficacy, safety, and then cost effectiveness. Evidence and quality will determine tier, but if evidence, safety are similar, that cost effectiveness to create the sustainability will kind of reign through. And then prior authorization criteria should not create barriers. It should create appropriateness of use. And that balance and that tension will never go away, but I think it's healthy so that we re-challenge ourselves as a health plan to really design a benefit that I think drives value. And then lastly, hopefully what you're hearing is early proactive engagement with providers, members, and analysis help us make the most informed decision, but timely, so we can reduce that time to NDC block and really improve that time to therapeutic innovation. So that being said, I appreciate you all listening. I'm finishing right on time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Leonard to carry on the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite all of our speakers back so we can answer some questions. Okay. So thank you all for your presentations. I think we are, this is such an interesting and diverse group, and the celiac community is so fortunate to benefit from your expertise and your perspective. So we appreciate you being here today, sharing your insights, and really helping us think about what the future might hold. So I know we have some questions. I think I'll start the first one for Jonathan. You mentioned that some arguments for insurers to cover something new would be to be more cost effective. And we've heard with celiac disease, the patient really carries the burden of the cost of treatment with the gluten-free diet. So really, what costs will be considered and to whom will this be considered?
I think it's a great question. I also think that it's going to differ by plan, differ by situation. I think in general that a health plan is thinking what's best for the members, balanced to the cost they pay. I think it is important when telling that story is costs are not just the medical costs, but for the non-medical costs, lost time at school, lost time at work, the added expense for finding nutrition. I do think that when making these arguments, that it really has to be a twofold argument. Number one, what is the plan responsible for? Can you make its financial situation easier? But as important to talk about the totality to the burden, the complexity of the care plan, and my experience, whether it's government payer, private payer, the payer wants to do the right thing, balanced to its legal constraints.
Thank you. Alex, in your talk, you were talking about how the US pays, 2.56 more per capita for pharmaceuticals than other nations. Patients with celiac disease, we've heard today, pay, 200% more, 2 to 4 times more for gluten-free food. How can we apply sort of what you've learned to, the food that patients with celiac disease need to eat and maybe the pharmaceuticals? Because a lot of the therapeutics that have been talked about today are still going to need to go hand in hand with the gluten-free diet. So that's increasing the costs even more.
Oof. I'll be honest. I'm not an expert on food costs. So I'm not sure I have a lot of good advice there. Yeah, I may pass on that question because you're going to need someone smarter than me to tell you how to find a good deal on gluten-free food. My sister-in-law has celiac disease, and I know it's something she struggles with. So if anyone has any good advice, let me know because yeah, could use some advice for her as well. But yeah, in terms of pricing, yeah, what we see sort of across the board, and it seems to be consistent not just in pharmaceuticals, but in healthcare more broadly. You see this number of 2 to 3 times more expensive in the United States as compared to any other comparable, sort of developed first world nation. And we're able at Cost Plus, our general savings on generic drug costs is about 60%. So the numbers seem to align, and it strikes me as not so much of a coincidence. So yeah, it really is, I think, our entire system of privatized health insurance leads to these inefficiencies that wind up inflating drug costs, be that misaligned incentives or just increased administrative burden. I think that's true of sort of healthcare broadly speaking. In terms of ways to reduce your drug costs, one, shameless promotion on my part. I can't help myself, CEO of the company. Try costplusdrugs.com, see if we happen to have the drug. But yeah, I heard it mentioned from some of the other speakers that ultimately, if you're part of if your employer is self-insured, they can overrule, their PBM. At the end of the day, they can, email the pharmacy benefit manager and say, hey, I want my, I CEO want my employee to get access to this medication. So that is something you can advocate for. The CEO might not necessarily be engaged enough in employee pharmaceutical benefits specifically, but I assure you they do have, if they dig into it enough, there is a special number or a special email they can call to get approvals. So that is something there. And yeah, we just advocate for direct contracting as much as possible, be that for pharmaceuticals or for healthcare more broadly. Mark Cuban has a new initiative outside of cost plus drugs, cost plus wellness, where he provides employers with contracts, templates to directly contract with local hospitals for cost plus drugs. We did that with Baylor Scott White, and our employees here love it because they get $0 deductibles for most of their health procedures. We, as an employer, pay less because of the direct contracts, and Baylor's, the local neighborhood hospitals actually get paid more, and on a more timely basis. They get paid on time instead of 9 months later. So sort of it's a win-win-win for everyone. So broadly speaking, try to direct contract as much as possible.
Great, thank you. I'll go around and next question for Laura. You mentioned that policy in Massachusetts with food. Do you have any insights into how that was passed or how we can get that into other states?
Yeah, so that is part of it's get really wonky for a moment, but it's called an 1115 waiver. And so it's an agreement between the federal government and the states that they can use Medicaid dollars in a different way. And so what Massachusetts has, and what actually a whole bunch of other states have now too, is what's called accountable care organizations, where instead of being paid fee for service for each procedure, they're actually paid a capitated amount per patient. And what this incentivizes is sort of whole patient care and really thinking about the social needs. And so I think any state can do an 1115 waiver. I think we're seeing a growth in ACOs and a growth in the interest and realizing the value of providing these social needs on reduction in healthcare costs. And so I think so I encourage states, people in different states to look at what their Medicaid agency is doing if they're applying for 1115 waivers. The evidence is coming out about these in Massachusetts and other states. And I think it's also it's sort of a model that commercial insurers can look at as well, right? If we actually see that providing some of these social services like, stipends for food or provision of food services reduces healthcare costs, and it's actually in the interest of the payer to cover those.
Great, that's great. Thank you. And Ryan, you mentioned, advocacy, and I really appreciated that last slide you had. We, as you mentioned, have great advocacy groups within celiac disease. The patients are vocal and they drive a lot of this. So how do we get all of this into the right hands? Because I think we need to start that now to really planting the seeds, since there's still a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding when it comes to celiac disease.
Yeah, I would reiterate that I think the voice of the patient or the member is so important, and it's a key process. We have patient family advisors that we invite onto our P&T committee to give us feedback on how important is this to them, and are we really hearing the member voice? And so I don't know if everyone's going to be a celiac advocate that's part of that patient family advisor group, but I think connecting with the advisor groups as new therapies coming forward, sending us kind of their stance on new therapeutics, the way we're getting access, I think is important. We always want to be able to evaluate that as part of the decision, right? There's a subspecialist that's there, that's great. But I think that the patient family voice is even just as important. And then I think lastly, doing our review of the clinical data. And that's really how we want to round out decisions. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as we move forward. So for them, I would just say sending that data to the health plans, to the leaders there, to make sure that they're incorporating what is, for instance, a foundation stance on a certain therapeutics. And we've seen this even in brain health, where you think of ALS. There is a disconnect between the therapeutics and the DME. And if there is a delay in the DME, patients with ALS, unfortunately living with ALS, don't have a ton of time. And so if there's any delays in authorizations, we're pulling away from their quality of life. And so one of the things we want to do is hear, hey, there's a disconnect between these within the policies, or this is something we ask you to look at. And I know that created a ton of value in streamlining health plan policy, but also member access in a timely manner. And so that's just one example of the impact that advocacy groups can make.
Great. Great. And then we have a question from the audience for Alex. She asks, what advice would you give for the pharma companies who are developing drugs for celiac disease to get first in line to get into cost plus drugs? Or is this something that the pharma companies think about at all?
Yeah, it's actually quite a challenge for us to get access to brand and specialty products at Cost Plus, because we're a relatively small company. Maybe 1% of the pharmacy industry after 3-4 years, which that's pretty not bad. Just getting off the ground. But that being said, the big three PBMs control, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of the market. And we have been told kind of behind closed doors, sort of over and over again in pretty blunt terms, like we would like for our products to be on costplusdrugs.com, but if we offered you a competitive price, we will face retaliation from the big three PBMs. Like it will affect the formulary placement of our products on the big formularies if we are seen to be doing business with Mark Cuban. So that's very, one is grossly anti-competitive, but it is what it is. There's no real way to enforce it. So yeah, I would say what we are continuing to do is just continue to get larger and larger and sort of chip away at it, show success. We do have access to a variety of brand name products from a variety of manufacturers now. Just added Eliquis from BMS and Pfizer onto our platform. What is it? Zofluza from Genentech, Invokana from J&J. So we do have a number of products that we're showing good movement with pharma companies sort of dipping their toe into waters with Cost Plus drugs. But yeah, our too good to be true proposal to sort of everyone who's involved in the actual administration of healthcare and the actual care of patients is, try to go around the intermediary actors as much as possible, be that the pharmacy benefit managers or any other entity, because you actually wind up making more. The pharmaceutical companies actually wind up making more in our model. That mesalamine example I used at the start of the talk, the pharmaceutical companies actually like giving us that price because as a small company, we don't have the same negotiating leverage as the big guys. So they actually get paid more from us in that $30 price point than they would at a big box retailer. And at the same time, dramatic savings to the patients. So yeah, it's actually in the pharmaceutical company's financial best interest, I think, to be working on these net cost arrangements as well.
Wow, that's great. Okay, thank you. I have two questions. I think we can get Laura and Ryan's perspective on both. One is just thinking about, we want to make sure that whatever is approved is available for as many people with celiac disease as possible. So how does achieving sort of payer coverage for therapies, how should we be thinking about clinical trial design?
Ryan, do you want to take that one or you want me to take it?
I can totally take it, but I wanted to, I'm from the South. I want to be a gentleman and give you the option to go first. No. So it's a great question, right? And I'm happy to jump into it. I think number one, to your point, we've got to design clinical trials with relevant endpoints. It needs to be an endpoint that not just the subspecialist physician or provider knows, but the payer has to agree to that as well. There has to be shared understanding that this is going to be a value driver endpoint. I think so many times we see composite endpoints or endpoints that are more antiquated because they were studied 10 years ago being pulled through in trials, or trials designed just compared to placebo alone, hoping that'll get the FDA approval, when in reality, when we think of current standard of care therapies, that still remains to be seen. And so to me, I think those are key criteria. I always want to look at the hazard ratio, right? What is that hazard ratio? And what is the confidence interval? And what are the secondary endpoints? And what's the inclusion-exclusion criteria? Because that will be pulled through. I see so many times broad labels, and then when we look at some of the actual endpoints, maybe it was really the primary endpoint was those with a greater than CPS for gastric cancer greater than 10, but the FDA approval is all comers, but those less than 10 didn't even meet statistical significance. So again, as a payer, you got to look at clinical efficacy, and you don't want to pay for something where there was an improvement, right? Because that's not being a good cost steward, let alone price, but utilization you have to steward as well. And so I would say when it's coming forward, those are key criteria to the design. We want to cover medications that are proven effective, that have good comparators, that have the right statistical design. That is the goal. But if people try to get around that and still want it to be covered, I think that's where the abrasion exists. And then lastly, how do we get it to the most members? Again, it comes in that inclusion exclusion criteria. And then I think too, there is some onus on the manufacturer. What is that net price for the therapy? And that net price is something that's going to be considered. And so when they bring that net price to market, that's got to be within the realm of price to willingness to pay threshold. So those would maybe be two things that I think are so important that I'm always evaluating to make sure I'm being a good steward of therapeutics.
Great. And Laura, before you go, maybe can you also touch on, you think, what role would patient-reported outcomes play in the coverage decision? And Ryan, you can remark on this too, but just in terms of, that's one of the key endpoints.
Yeah, no, and I think kind of building on what Ryan was saying as well, we're seeing more and more drugs that come to market. For instance, a lot of oncology drugs that are coming to market right now, they're being approved by the FDA on surrogate endpoints that actually we're finding are not correlating with like extended survival, right? So the actual thing that FDA is approving isn't something the payers and actually patients really care about. So I think this is where patient-reported outcomes becomes really important to sort of justify if we are looking at surrogate endpoints, why those are so important to patients and why they actually matter for quality of life.
And I'll just add, I think quality of life indicators are always important, but I think for some disease like celiac, they really stand out. For myelofibrosis, they really stand out. There's other areas though where actually just the clinical improvement is so important, and we want objective endpoints as well as patient-reported outcomes, right? Because we want the patient to feel better, but we want an objective endpoint that can reduce bias and we can really anchor to show that we're being disease modifying and not just kind of symptom control.
Thanks. And another question is just based on what we heard earlier, there's a lot of talk about the shift in the way we're diagnosing celiac disease. So there is a movement towards a non-biopsy approach, which may sort of shift who's diagnosing celiac disease to more primary care providers. We also know celiac disease in rare cases, patients may present with dermatitis herpetiformis, so they're being diagnosed by a dermatologist. If there's serology diagnosis, that could be it could be diagnosed by a variety of physicians. So how might that play into like who patient access to medication, who can actually prescribe this?
I might start on that one because I did say in my presentation specialist, but what I want to clarify that because I think it's a really important point. I do think primary care is going to play such an important role in the future. I will say a lot of people are targeting primary care. They need to be looking at preclinical Alzheimer's. They need to be evaluating CKD. They need to be evaluating celiac. They need to be evaluating obesity and MASH. And I don't know if primary care is ready for all of that. And I would say, especially with their RVU load compared to some faculty or specialist providers, it's insane they even see the number of patients they see in current state. And how are they going to accurately maintain the competency and acumen to get that right? That being said, I do think that they can do it, but it might be a subgroup that might be credentialed. I want to think about hepatology. We initially brought forward Hep C medications. We went to a hepatologist, and everyone had to go there, and we did a liver biopsy because that's what was done in the trial. But over time, we got familiar with fiber scans that could be done in clinic. We got familiar with not just hepatologists, potentially primary care running that serology and determining whether they had a durable response. So I think we might see that navigation as well as something, as long as we have something that we can look to in evidence, like a fiber scan, non-invasive versus biopsy, I'm always a fan of that. And it costs less too. And I think as we get it in front of some of the primary care providers, if they can do that in their offices and have serology to not only track an objective diagnosis criteria, but improvement, I think I'm all for that. And we find, just like we did with hepatology, who are those credentialed primary care providers or dermatologists. And I think we roll that forward in creating better patient access and getting more treated and managed appropriately.
Great, thank you. And I think I'll just ask one more question for anyone here who wants to give an answer before we head into the next session. But what evidence, based on what we've heard today, what you know of celiac disease, what sort of evidence gaps exist today that could delay the progress that we're all hoping to make, or what research should be prioritized now to sort of really make sure we're on the road once we have a drug approved?
I'll just jump in, but I think when, as I mentioned in my talk, in addition to clinical effectiveness and getting FDA approval, I think showing how this, benefits patients, but also reduces healthcare costs potentially and the impact it has, and that will be increasingly important. And other countries very explicitly measure this, right? So in the UK, they very explicitly look at cost effectiveness and comparative effectiveness in their coverage decisions, and we do this a little more opaquely in the US. But I think these sorts of studies are going to be really important as payers make their decisions.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go out. Alex, you go
Oh,
first.
no, go ahead. I'm going to give a very cynical response, which is, a lot of these conversations we have behind the scenes, are very blunt in terms of, okay, the pharmaceutical company, if I give you this price and this amount of fees, like, can I skip prior authorization for your patients? Can I get one of one cover formulary placement, which is I'm the sole farm drug available for this indication, or can I be one of two? Can I be one of three? Is there a step therapy in order to get to my medication? Well, if I give you this price and this amount of money, will that step therapy go away? These conversations tend to be very blunt behind the scenes. So, although there are, in fact, of course, good faith P&T committees, particularly for self-insured employers, your average HR person at a IT company is not going to have the bandwidth to know the, clinical indications for therapies for celiac disease, let alone, 1,000 other conditions that their patients might have. So they rely on consultants who also get kickback and fees from the big PBMs. So yeah, I think it really is to focus not just on the clinical evidence, because yes, that is important. There are people who take that in good faith. There are policymakers who evaluate this, but there's also broader commercial factors that come into play that are not necessarily aligned with clinical indications, and it's to be cognizant of that and be prepared to sort of fight them, be that through advocacy or through the power of the pocketbook, and just insisting on more transparent actors.
And then maybe I'll round it out. I think we still need a clear, I would say, responder definition. Is it symptom reduction? Is it histological healing? Is it gluten intolerance? Is it all three as a endpoint? I think there's still a system to histology disconnect as well, right? Like patients may feel better without mucosal healing, but like histological improvement, does that come into play? We thought about patient-reported outcomes, right? Like celiac symptoms can overlap with IBS. So is there FODMAP sensitivity? Is there lactose intolerance? Like how do we start to really drive clarity to the decision makers? And then I just think there's longer term durability of response, right? We don't want breakthrough symptoms. And how do we provide that durability? And I think those are all the evidence gaps that still remain to be tackled. But it's exciting, right? Because that's the future. And if we can anchor around those outcomes, I think we're truly going to improve lives, but not just improve lives, but provide hope.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This was such a great session. I learned so much. So thank you for being here, and we will sign out and see you in the next session.